The tragic event of April 9th, 1989 in Tbilisi is a most controversial story related to Eduard Shevardnadze, already an all-union leader at that time. Here's what happened. We were in Cuba visiting Fidel Castro, a 2-day trip. Then we flew back with a layover in London. In the late night of April 6th, Mikhail Gorbachev, Raisa Gorbacheva, and a Soviet delegation of senior officials arrived at Heathrow Airport. We met with Margaret Thatcher. The officials accompanying Gorbachev were the most active participants of the dialogue between the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze met with his British counterpart, Geoffrey Howe. On April 7, 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev delivered a speech from the rostrum of London's prestigious Guildhall. The speech was praised by British political and social circles. Then we returned. It must have been 7-8 p.m., April 7th, when we got back to Moscow. Ligachev, Gorbachev's second-in-command, reported unrest in Tbilisi. I was caught off guard because Gorbachev had not told me anything about it. I did suspect, however, and I still do, that they must have called to inform him, since they attached so much importance to the events of April 1989 in Tbilisi. Be that as it may, Gorbachev seemed surprised. "What's going on?" he asked, and then turned to me. "Do you know anything about it?" "No, I don't," I replied. On April 8th, he held meetings with India's and then Pakistan's foreign ministers. Then he attended a Politburo session and gave a speech at a collegium meeting. So my question is, how could he have possibly flown to Tbilisi and back? When you're a foreign minister, everything is registered. Who comes in, who leaves, their names, positions, their visits, durations, what time you get off work. Everything is stored and available on file. I had these records pulled out. Not a single hour available on my schedule. Thus, all those tall tales about Shevardnadze allegedly arriving in Georgia on April 8th, probably using the cap of invisibility to vanish again after the special operations were carried out, all this is nothing but fairy tales. We were debating whether or not to fly to Georgia. The incoming telegrams gave a sense of the situation being under control, so it wasn't absolutely necessary to be present there. Otherwise, we were ready to set out as early as April 8th. I still don't know what would have happened if I arrived. The crowd may have swelled even further. However, because he was the country's foreign minister, technically this case did not concern him, though he also had served as a leader of Georgia's party organization. So it makes perfect sense that he and Mr. Razumovsky, one of the rank-and-file secretaries of the Central Committee, flew to Tbilisi the next day to get to the bottom of things, so to speak. It took 3 days for the military, the commander of the internal troops, Rodionov, and others to spill the beans about having used rubber batons. Then Menegarishvili took active steps to supply me with information. For example, Tamar Dekanosidze and others were reporting that chemical weapons had been used. The military finally admitted to having utilized so-called Cheromukha tear gas grenades, the same type as used elsewhere, as we found out later. Trust me, one cannot begin to imagine how hard Eduard Shevardnadze came down on the military. Naturally, it was the most difficult test for him as a human being, and his face showed it. Usually, however, it was nearly impossible to deduct emotions from his countenance, and you can take my word for it.
I told this
to Mr. Jumbur Patiashvili personally that going out to meet the crowd, young people, would have been the best solution for him. And not just young people, because there were also intelligentsia members and many others. He should have told them what he had to say. If they believed him, very good. But if they did not, his conscience would have been clean, if anything. As a rule, putting the army to work and using force must be coordinated with the commander-in-chief. And who was commander-in-chief? Gorbachev. Without him, they couldn't use force. Now imagine that Kochitov and Rodionov decide to crack down on the demonstration. Wouldn't they report to the defense minister? Or imagine the defense minister holding it back from the commander-in-chief. What troubled me was the thought that my people could suspect me of knowing about it all the while I was somewhere abroad, a stain on my conscience. In a totalitarian state, it's always dangerous for people to self-organize, to hold unauthorized bottom-up rallies instead of government-approved demonstrations on, let's say, May 1st or November 7th. In the Soviet period after Stalin's death, rallies of this kind were organized 3 times. In March 1956, April 1978, and April 1989, with the first and last ending tragically. The events of 1978 ended without bloodshed, and importantly, the main demand was eventually met. When talking about 1956, yes, we can say that Stalin had just died, and it was still a totalitarian state, even bloodier and crueler. But what about 1989? The empire was already crumbling and collapsing, and yet 20 people were killed on April 9th, right? But what's the difference between these 3 events? And why the first and the last were bloody, unlike the one in the middle? The answer is simple. In 1978, Eduard Shevardnadze was secretary of the Central Committee. That's why. I'm often asked about the decision to take down the Berlin Wall, to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, also about Germany's reunification. I believe that these laid a cognitive foundation and marked a turning point in world views to set in motion a new era. And this revolution at the turn of the century had just 2 or 3 architects, Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze among them. The whole world recognizes it, and it is not our Georgian wishful thinking. In my mind, the Berlin Wall was associated with the Iron Curtain, a widely discussed topic for decades, both in the West and the East. And my personal relationship with Genscher played a unique role in this case. I first met Eduard on August 1st, 1985, in Helsinki, at an event celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Helsinki Accords. After a face-to-face conversation with him, I told my colleagues, this is one man we can trust. We were in Canada. Jim caught me by surprise when he approached me and suggested that we, the ministers, start working seriously on the reunification of Germany. It was a time when demonstrations were already in full swing in East Germany. So we held a ministerial and decided to work on this issue. We kept pressing on for over 18 months, with meetings in Moscow, Bonn, Berlin. And I must admit that these talks were no bed of roses. I had the Politburo on my back, charged with approving my every speech in advance. And when we had talks in Berlin, under the 2+4 mechanism, my speech, previously approved by the Politburo, was very harsh. In other words, it was the only time when I could not openly endorse Germany's reunification. As Edward was delivering a speech, Baker sent me a note, wondering what Edward's words could have possibly meant. Genscher replies that it's just a facade.
That's right, I remember that.
This means that we were on the same page. I think it was a major achievement because I had a sense that World War III was in the air. Can you imagine 40,000 tanks in Central Europe? If memory serves, there were 500,000 Soviet citizens, and rallies in support of German reunification gaining momentum. What were we supposed to do? Unleash those tanks? Yes, we could, and they would have cut a wide swath all the way to the Atlantic Ocean within 24 hours. And what would that mean? World War III. Gorbachev was taking bold decisions. He did everything for our plan and key goals of diffusing tensions and normalizing relations with these countries to end the Cold War. And I was in charge of this direction.
Установить нормальные отношения с этими странами, покончить с холодной войной, эту линию я проводил.
During face-to-face meetings, we talked or just looked around.
I should interrupt here and say that what Eduard has just told you is absolutely true in terms of this being probably the most difficult issue that we had to grapple with, because there was substantial resistance to the idea of Germany in NATO. And we would have our private meetings, and the Eduard Shevardnadze that I would see in a private meeting, or Genscher would see, or Dumas would see, or Douglas Hurd would see, was not the Eduard Shevardnadze we'd see when we got everybody around the table, because there were people looking over his shoulder who made it much more difficult for the Soviet Union to come to the position that, yes, Germany should be unified and it should be unified as a member of NATO. And this was an exceedingly difficult brief for the foreign minister of the Soviet Union at that time. And I remember that very, very well.
I was well aware of his situation, and I tried to stand by him in every way, to be his friend and cushion the negative attitude of the Soviet Union's leadership toward him. I sensed that the foreign minister of the GDR also had an insight into the scheme of things, but he had no say in this. The main decision maker is sitting right here next to me. It was said that while one Georgian divided Germany, another Georgian contributed to its reunification. Of course, I thank the author of these words, Hans Dietrich. I also added, keep in mind, though, that if you take Georgians out of big politics, you get nothing.
In
1993, if I'm not mistaken, the UN published a report claiming that ending the Cold War helped the West save about $3 to $4 trillion a year. What hurts most is that, in the minds of some politicians, The era of new thinking died along with the Cold War, and that was a misconception that cost humanity dearly. I believed that ending the Cold War and eradicating totalitarian regimes would provide fertile ground for new thinking and new people-to-people and cross-border relations. And this is what humanity missed out on.
ახალი ურთიერთობებისათვის ადამიანებსა და ქვეყნებს შორის, სახელმწიფოებს შორის. აი აქ კაცობრიობამ გარკვეული დრო დაკარგა.
And I would like to ask the two leaders of the Senate here.
One had to be prepared for it better than Gorbachev was. Gorbachev, not Shevardnadze, because it was a former's job to publish a dissolution concept, something outside the latter's jurisdiction. Still, what Shevardnadze did as an executive minister, creating an atmosphere for dissolution, was a major determinant. You know, I am no novice at resigning.
I
was in the upper echelon, safe from anything except from occasional criticism from Alksnis and the likes of him. Injustice was overwhelming, and I saw that democracy was in need of defending from advancing dictatorship. So, I just stepped forward and, instead of reporting, made a statement. Nobody knows what shape this dictatorship will assume, what kind of dictator will take over, or what rules will be enforced. I am stepping down. Do not overreact or judge me. Look at my resignation, or protest, if you will, as a gesture against the advancement of dictatorship. I am deeply grateful to Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. I am his friend, and together we have had major accomplishments in the international arena. But I will not accept the processes unfolding in the country and the challenges looming over our people. I still believe that dictatorship will fail, because the future belongs to democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Диктатура не пройдет, что будущее за демократией и за свободой. Спасибо большое.
Мучительный для меня вопрос.
Are you calling for resistance in any form? Do you accept that resistance may be violent?
Сопротивление должно быть и насильственно?
Нет. Я не призываю к этому и даже не так.
No, I do not call for or accept it. I just don't want anything of this kind to happen. Because you know what violent resistance is about, don't you? Unarmed people on one hand, and the Soviet Union's military potential on the other. You know what steps the defense minister may take, don't you? What force and technology he may use against people? It has happened before in the streets of Tbilisi, Vilnius, Riga. You know what they're capable of, don't you? Will they still say they don't know?
Мы знаем, на что способны они. Может, и сейчас они скажут, что он не знает.
Next, Yeltsin is said to have decided to take power at any cost. But in fact, he also sacrificed a lot for the sake of Russia. All this resulting in what is happening today. Many political scientists say that it's all Shevardnadze's fault. That the Soviet Union would have been around if it had not been for Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze broke up the Soviet Union. It's all bluff, nonsense. These people are totally ignorant of politics. It was big politics, ultimately seeking to avert World War III and normalize relations with Western countries.
Предотвращение Третьей мировой войны и нормализация отношений с западными странами.
Minister Shevardnadze's resignation and warning, I think, has to be taken seriously. In my experience, Minister Shevardnadze has always worked as a professional who served his country's interests. He was in the forefront of the new thinking in foreign policy and democratization at home, and I think that he has earned the respect of leaders all around the world. Let me say that I've known Eduard Shevardnadze to be a man of his word, a man of courage, conviction, and principle.
I now realize that, besides political goals, they came to offer solid protection to Shevardnadze. Welcome back to my home.
Once again, I greet you in my house.
Thank you. Once again,
Thank you. It feels good to be back. I'm as happy as ever. Give my best to your wife. If I'm not mistaken, he was 10th on the list of those consigned for execution. What saved him was that the coup, which took place after his resignation, lasted only 3 days. Not enough time, and that's why he survived.
ტერორისტები ჩამოდიოდნენ. ტერორისტები.
I was officially warned that terrorists had arrived from Georgia. The late Jaba Iossi Liani had sent 2 or 3 of his men to prevent what those terrorists had in mind.
სამი კაცი გამოგზავნა იმისათვის, რომ ამ ტერორისტებს თავისი მიზანი ვერ ეასრულებინათ.
In the Soviet period, Georgia was a province of a vast totalitarian empire, explaining why Georgia had no part in real politics conducted by Moscow.
საქართველოს შეეძლო სისხლის ღურის გარეშე.
Georgia could achieve independence without bloodshed, wars, and calamities, much the way Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states did. There were movements too, but under different circumstances, and emotions were suppressed. That's why after the empire collapsed, we found ourselves totally unprepared for the real challenges facing us. An independent country decides on its own with whom it wages war, to whom it complains, with whom it maintains foreign relations, and regulates domestic affairs and state building, economic and political issues. But in our case, it turned out to be beyond reach. We happened to be unprepared. We were not ready for independence, as simple as that. In 1991, the confrontation between the opposition and Gamsakuria's government boiled over. Serious incidents took place in Tbilisi and elsewhere. Processes were escalating with no solution in sight. There's just no way out for the country. I received some information mostly from those coming to Moscow, including intelligentsia representatives and young people, by the way. We just met casually, and I was keen on learning the latest news from Georgia. It must have been clear to the whole world, not just to me, that he was a politician of enormous proportions, and Georgia, potentially, could take advantage of this vast resource. All politicians are born for their homelands to make full use of their resources. I was on edge. Firstly, I really wanted him to come to Georgia because, frankly, I'm a Georgian to the core. My heart was aching with concern for our country, and I believed that he could help it. It was a war of all against all. Naturally, nobody recognized the government after the military coup, and it would take a major figure of international authority to secure this recognition. Eduard Shevardnadze was one such person. The biggest struggle I went through was against myself. I actually had to transfer from a dictatorship into a different system, a democracy, as a committed and resolute Democrat. And his arrival in Georgia meant putting a stop to the polarization of society across a variety of directions. Georgia at that time resembled Lebanon, and his international reputation saved the country from Lebanonization. Other politicians of his caliber would have likely steered away from Georgia, worrying about the reputation. In terms of personal interests, it was not prudent or normal. For all intents and purposes, I had to decline. But on the other side of the coin, there was a moral aspect. All are obligated to do everything when in their homeland, and people are in need. This would be a mistake on the part of any politician. By not coming back, he could have avoided many problems, which means he was beyond reproach. Those 2 months, January and February, before Shevardnadze's return from Moscow, could have lasted an eternity without him, and Georgia would have ceased to exist as a state. The country was devastated, ruined, in shambles. Nowadays, many tend to forget this. It tears at my heart to see people forget it. Ingratitude is such an ugly trait. All experience is good experience. Even negative experience is a good schooling. It's all about his unusual principles and loyalty to his homeland, alongside his deep-rooted vision of Georgia becoming independent. The situation in Georgia was so dire that coming back home felt like going through hell and back. The effect of his return would have been far greater if he had come back to find Georgia in a normal condition, similar to any war-free republic, such as Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. At that time, the country had virtually no government. Naturally, the arrival of a politician of his rank at that time was decisive for the country. I returned from Moscow to Georgia in March 1992. I visited His Holiness, who praised my decision and blessed me. We have many friends who want and can help us, but that must be combined with hard work on our part, with our dedication and unity, and only then we may be able to save the country. This is how I see it. No stretch, the situation is dire. If we fathom the danger awaiting us, we may be able to stick together and fight toward our common goal. I cannot recognize my own country and people. Brother against brother, a sight particularly striking on Rustaveli Avenue. The Parliament building, the first gymnasium, and the Tbilisi Hotel in ruins. The artist's house razed to the ground. The children's palace riddled with bullets. Almost everything. Manufacturing and agricultural broken. Everything is on hold. And the first thing I did was go to the farmer's market, but I couldn't find a single Georgian product. Everything was imported from Turkey. Everything. God bless you for coming back. God bless you. Hopelessness is unacceptable. What can we do? We must keep on living. Don't give up. We must stick together to deal with it all. Unless we set aside retaliation, it will never end, and our children and their children will pay the price. This must be imported, right? I wanted to buy one for 1,500 rubles as a present for Giga. I was hoping to save some money. The first thing I said after coming back from Moscow was that my goal here was to roll up my sleeves and work.
People
often question the speed of these reforms, how fast they were implemented. Reforms usually take place in a given country with an established political system. But here in Georgia, we started building a brand new state from the ground up. In 1991 to 92, when these processes were just starting, we were not the previous state's ideological or economic successor country. We were building a totally new state. We have been through so much, our people have endured so many tribulations, that it is only through the divine will that we have survived. The Patriarch deserves full credit for Eduard Shevardnadze's coming to believe in God. Now we say that Georgia is a lot of the Virgin Mary, and probably for good reason. Some think that it's only a legend, others that it's just hot air. But it isn't. There are many legends, as I heard as a child, that eventually proved to be historically accurate. Now that baptism has been performed, I made my decision about baptism, and you made yours, because Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze is now a believer. Baptism is impossible without faith. He chose a name for me. He said, Edward is a good name, but it isn't Georgian. So I decided to name you Georgi. Times change and we change with them. Importantly, we must change for the better. This was not a relationship between a president and a patriarch, but rather an interaction between two like-minded persons embracing common values. And this naturally evolved into a human relationship and friendship in due course. The Patriarch's role is enormous in what President Shevardnadze has achieved towards the country's development, for example. I remember the years 1992 to 1994. Many of our compatriots, said back then that we were ready to survive on grass alone as long as we were independent. Has anyone gone on a grass diet? Not to my knowledge.
After he resigned as foreign minister in December 1990, Eduard Shevardnadze could have retired to private life, assured of his place in history. But instead, he has continued to make history. As president of Georgia, he has struggled to protect his country's independence, preserve its unity, and promote economic and political reform. His time as president has not been easy. In fact, it's been marked by extreme personal danger.
Shevardnadze's arrival in Georgia was immediately followed by a vibrant process of state building. With constant clashes in Tbilisi, car thefts, no public transport, with the subway system out of service, I feel embarrassed to ride in a car. Hundreds and thousands who are walking to get around will spit at you for driving around and doing nothing. Fix a subway at least. I am over the moon today because now, thanks to an additional energy supply, the subway will run from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's the best we can do at this point.
ჯერტი გახდათ ქაოსი საქართველოში ორი ომი პრაქტიკულად უკვე
Chaos raged in Georgia. 2 wars had practically broken out already. One was a fratricidal conflict, and the other involved the fight for territorial integrity.
უკვე დაწყებული ომი ბრძოლა ტერიტორიული მთლიანობისათვის.
მე არ შემიძლია ახლა არ გავიხსენო, იცით? ცხინვალში მე ბოლოს ვიყავი 92 წელს.
I must absolutely recall my last visit to Tskhinvali in 1992 in the company of Mr. Zasakov, current president of the Republic of North Ossetia, and the late Mr. Jaba Iosiliani. We entered Tskhinvali. The war was not over yet. We were about to walk down the main street as we heard gunshots. Who's shooting? We asked. Apparently, shots were fired from the Georgian side. Not from where we would expect a gunfire, but from the Georgian side, meaning that those were traitors, people who betrayed both Ossetians and Georgians. Thank God I survived. For better or worse, I'm still alive by the grace of God. Who destroyed everything? We did, right? For 3 or 4 years, we didn't harvest a single ear of corn, a single kilogram of wheat. And after we finally started land reform, a revolutionary step in itself for Georgia, one that even Russia and Ukraine were hesitant to take, we eventually secured locally produced goods in the country. We wasted 4 or 5 years on these war games, and I'm not oversimplifying the essence of war here. The wars that we had were more than real. One civil war, then another wave. We seem to have forgotten standing in line for bread at 2 a.m., hoping that maybe half a kilo may come our way later in the morning. There was a shortage of flour. People were ready to kill for bread. There was no gas, so there were no garbage trucks, buses, or cars in the streets. Retailers were not supplied. Nothing was happening whatsoever. Nothing at all. The whole world was very supportive of Georgia, not least thanks to Shevardnadze's impeccable reputation. Finally, we had a breakthrough, largely fostered by my friends, by the way. In April, German Foreign Minister Genscher arrived. He assured me of his friendship and pledged to support us in every way, but not as long as you're a military council member lacking legitimacy, he told me, and suggested that I hold elections no matter what. He also announced the decision of the OSCE to allocate a €70 million credit to Georgia, a move that saved the country on the brink of starvation. There was no other source to meet the basic needs of the population. An entertaining side story. Mr. Genscher traveled more than any other minister. Once, Reagan asked me, "Who's the most frequent flyer?" "Genscher, of course," I replied. Then you may have heard of this story. 2 planes collide in the air, with Genscher aboard both. I couldn't wait to tell this joke to Genscher, but apparently he was well aware of it. After I finally got to share it with him, he said, "There's more to the story. One of the passengers survived." "Really?" "Yes, it was Genscher who survived." Incidentally, he resigned the day after his Georgia visit, as though paying his dues before leaving. In May, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker visited Georgia.
But that visit, when Jim Baker came to Tbilisi,
Baker's visit was of historic importance. It signaled a major change, testifying that the country now had champions and friends.
When Eduard Shevardnadze returned to Georgia, Georgia was a country in great distress, and there was a lot of civil unrest at the time. He has been the subject of several assassination attempts. He had been there for 2 months when he called me as a friend. I was still Secretary of State. It was, I think, in May of 1992. And he called me and he said it would mean so much to me and to the future of this small republic if you had an opportunity to stop by here on your next into the region or to Europe, I can't remember. And I went by. And I spent one evening, I think, in Tbilisi, if my memory serves me correctly. I was put up at a guest house, which used to be the dacha of Lavrentiy Beria, and at night listening to gunshots all around the city. Because the city really, I mean, Georgia was still subject to a great deal of unrest. But it didn't worry Eduard. And he would come in the evening or in the morning and always in a happy mood. And the next day, he said, we're going to go down, I'm going to show you some parts of Tbilisi. And we went downtown and there was a huge rally underway. And he said it would really be good if we could just walk through the crowd here and say hello to 1 or 2 people. And so I was in no position to say, no, I'm too afraid to do that. So we got out of the car and we started into the crowd, and my security detail was apoplectic, absolutely. But that didn't stop him, and he pushed forward all the way up to a platform where some people were giving speeches, and he said, let's get up here and just say a word or two to the crowd.
My behavior back then must have looked inexcusable for a head of state. My bodyguards objected to me. What are you doing? It's a mistake of historic proportions. I replied, you take care of Baker's bodyguards and let me handle Baker himself.
Well, what I told them was, you take care of Baker's security people, I will take care of Baker.
Recognition stood for accession to the United Nations, of course, and all other international organizations. The next step was joining organizations with tougher membership criteria, and that must have been the factor bringing about assistance for the country. Georgia was in dire straits. There was no manufacturing in those years, and the country was living solely off humanitarian aid. And I had to succeed in delivering the country from that chaos and anarchy at all costs. I had to build a democracy from scratch, as it were, and that was no easy task.
და ჩვენ იმ უაღრესად გაჭირებულ ხანს გვჭირდებოდა სწორედ ევროკავშირის დახმარება იმისათვის რომ
We needed assistance from the EU to survive and get through those tough times. Indeed, we received enormous assistance from the EU in the 1990s, including food, mainly wheat. Without wheat supplies from the EU and the US, we wouldn't have survived.
ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატებიდან ჩვენ ვერ გავიტანდით თავს, ვერ გადავრჩებოდით, ესე იგი.
June 1992 saw the OSCE summit in Helsinki and a meeting with Bush Sr. on its margins.
Old friend, respected friend, how are you?
We're sitting there with the delegation, and Mr. Shevardnadze says, I know that every head of state and every president comes to you asking for favors. I am here to ask you for nothing. He looked at Shevardnadze and said, fire away, Edward. What do you need? What did he need? The country was about to run out of wheat in a matter of weeks. Let me remind you that it was July 1992, that we entered the summit hall, and Baker gestured to me to see him outside. He told me, go tell Edward to relax. 50,000 tons is already in the Black Sea. That grain saved my homeland from starvation. In July, Georgia hosted Demirel, Turkey's prime minister at the time and future president. As the civil war raged here, blood was being shed, and shooting seemed ceaseless in the city's streets. We laid the foundation for Turkey-Georgia relations. As far as I know, the government of France has made a statement on committing to establishing diplomatic relations with Georgia. So I guess we're throwing off the shackles of isolation, a well-deserved success. That secured full legitimacy and recognition. I remember the Mwambe news program going through a rough patch. We worked without being paid for 18 months. There was no money, only coupons circulating. I remember how he did everything for us to make a living. And I assure you that he didn't use budget money for that. It involved assistance from businessmen on his initiative. And it applied not only to Mwambe, but to all employees of the TV station. In 1992, we created a press service at his office, purposefully recruiting all popular journalists. With a new state in the making from scratch, journalists had no relevant experience.
ყველაფერი რაც ხდებოდა პრეზიდენტის კარზე იყო ღია აბსოლუტურად.
Everything happening around the president's office was absolutely transparent, including his meetings, negotiations, decisions, plans, schedules, and topics to be addressed. And the president's immediate setting was a place where journalists could find these things. Nobody can deny the enormous comfort and freedom media representatives felt while dealing with him. Even the most critical media outlets were acceptable to Shevardnadze, in line with his principles. That period also saw the birth of parliamentarianism. The first parliament was elected with no electoral threshold. This was his idea too. Why? He used to say that it was better to have these people in parliament than in the streets. Consequently, there were some that otherwise would never have become MPs. Some parties were represented by just a couple of members. Others cursed and swore right and left during sessions. How dare you use foul language here? From the outside, he seemed composed and unmoved, but on the inside, he was one of the most emotional persons I ever met. He was an emotional person, of course. He just did not show it. Similar to others, I believe that it was the most democratic parliament because Shevardnadze was never afraid of different opinions or criticism. Behind the curtain, we were all friends, but turned into enemies during parliament sessions. There was one female Swedish politician. She had a meeting with our MPs, and just as she opened her mouth, somebody started nailing something to the ceiling. She looked at Mr. Shevardnadze, then up at the ceiling. Shevardnadze looked back at her, then up at the ceiling. Apparently, it was a worker repairing something. Bodyguards rushed to stop him. 10 minutes later, as the Swedish politician was about to make another remark, the worker resumed hammering. Shevardnadze looked at her and said, "Ma'am, we're building a democracy. Can't help it."
ყოველთვის აკეთებდა ჩანაწერებს აი იმერლის პარლამენტის ხდომათა დარბაზში და ხანდახან ეს ჩანაწერები რჩებოდა და დიდი ინტერესი.
He always made notes during parliament sessions. Sometimes he left them there, and we peeked into them out of curiosity. Apparently, they were related to very ordinary things and events. In terms of spelling, punctuation, and Georgian wording, these notes were perfect. One of the reasons why I had enormous respect for him. Even in personal notes, he would not accept poor language.
იმიტომ რომ ადამიანი თავისთვის გაკეთებულ ჩანაწერშიც კი არ უშვებს იმას, რომ რაღაც შეიძლება იყოს გაუმართავი.
I have seen Shevardnadze in all kinds of situations. I have seen him angry, disappointed, even desperate, but never at a loss or scared. For 3 or 4 days now, we have been stuck on the situation in Zugdidi, dealing with different regions one by one over this past week, like firefighters rushing from one building to another. Unless we calm down, pull ourselves together, and establish some kind of basic order in the country, democracy is not even up for discussion. There can be no democracy building in a disorderly and starving country. One day, Shevardnadze decided to visit several regions hit hard by the civil war. He picked Samegrela to visit first. Shevardnadze was a brave man. I have seen him prove this more than once. He made a decision, and we entered Zugdidi, a real hornet's nest. We were bombarded with tomatoes, rocks, and so on. He was dressed in a white shirt. As we walked through the streets, tons of curses and various objects were hurled against us.
In
Zugdidi, we were kept on our toes. Our helicopter was targeted from the ground, forcing us to reverse course and head for Tsalanjikha, where we subsequently went through fire and water. The locals surrounded our helicopter. We landed in the Tsalanjikha soccer stadium. As we exited the stadium, the crowd cornered us near the gate. Mr. Shevardnadze tried to clutch at the gate. Somebody grabbed him by the hand and attempted to snatch him. We barely pulled him away. Shevardnadze had this amazing talent of persuasion. He could talk his conversation partners over within 10-15 minutes. That's why some people tried to prevent his contact with ordinary citizens by exclaiming commands like, "Don't listen to him," and "Keep moving." This was his major area of strength. Then we turned around and rushed to fly to Chkorovsku. It's easy to remember and talk about it in hindsight, but it's a different story when you're in the eye of the storm, a really dangerous situation. And I remember the courageous expression on Mr. Shevardnadze's face and his actions, not even once avoiding direct contact with people. And then he said, if we're bound to be hit, we will get hit one way or another. You can run, but you can't hide. Looking at him as the face of our nation filled me with pride, knowing that the country's leader can stare death in the face without flinching. You cannot really instruct and tell someone to be brave, fearless in a critical situation. Those things should come natural. You either have it in you or you don't. Fatalism was one of his personal traits. No matter what, he was a fatalist. He believed that if it's your time to die, you will die no matter what. If it's not, then you'll survive. I've always believed that whatever is destined to happen will happen, and fear certainly won't help it. You should be careful, all right, but if you're afraid, you should quit. You're better off staying away from this line of work. This is not fatalism, this is faith in something. Wherever he showed his courage, he did it with his truth and his faith. He could mingle with people and blend into the crowd so fast that we had no time to take necessary safety measures. It was no picnic. He would object and demand that we let people near him, and that's a painful, touchy matter for security.
ძიმე და მტკივნეული თემა არის.
და მიაჩნდა რომ ეს დამცავი მექანიზმები
And he believed he could do without those security mechanisms. Even though he had excellent bodyguards trained by Americans, he always felt that he was protected by a higher power, divine providence.
უფრო დიდი დაცვა ყავს. და განგება იცავს. აი ეს განცდა ქონდა სულ.
Eduard Shevardnadze ამ ფონზე იყო.
Eduard Shevardnadze embodied a high level of political culture. With his setbacks and major achievements, with his difficult and yet easygoing personality, he, like every human being, had his own strong and weak points alike. But when it came to political decisions, he was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He also had something totally missing among our politicians and functionaries. He was a good listener, and that's very important.
ის რაც მას ამ კაბინეტში ჩამდა ადამიანს ყოველთვის აკლია.
Similar to anyone stuck in the office, he missed having direct contact with people and keeping in touch with them. Something he compensated for by listening. In fact, he never stopped being a politician. Politics was his passion. I've seen so many people happy about what they believe to have been a nice conversation with Shevardnadze. As a journalist, I scrutinized them and asked, "What did you say? And what did he say?" And as a rule, I deducted that they were the ones doing all the talking, while Shevardnadze listened, only occasionally making sparring remarks here and there. Ultimately, however, they believed that they had just had a nice two-way conversation. Most importantly, Shevardnadze always let people speak out and say what they had to say. They're better off talking to me, putting everything on the table, he used to say. Many of you, including your humble servant, put up with things ordinary people cannot handle as a rule. But when the country needs your service and sacrifice does not necessarily mean jumping off the cliff while screaming that you love Georgia. No. Sacrifice means enduring what people normally find very hard to endure.
ნიშნავს იმას, რომ მოითმინო ის, რის მოთმენაც ნორმალურ ადამიანისთვის ძალიან ძნელია.